Before we jump into handling forms in our app, we're going to go ahead and do it in our contact page. So that contact page view, making sure that we still have it wrapped in and it's still there. All right. So I'm going to change the template from hello world to form.html. So that means in my templates, I'm going to make a new one called form.html. And this is going to extend, so extends from base.html, and it's going to take in some block content. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and put a form in, and this is just a raw HTML form. So the first thing you can do is input type, and you can say something like text and give it a name. In my case, I'll say full name. You can also do input type email and give it an email. And then you can do text area also with a name and just say content. And then you can also do a button, type equals to submit, and we'll just say send. Okay, so now let's make sure our view has form.html and it also has this context. So we'll add that into our form and I'll just say if title, I'll do h1 title. The reason I did this is because I have this h1 tag here. If you just did raw title, that h1 tag would still be there. It just would have something empty. So I just did it like that. All right, so now let's go to our contact page. I believe it's just /contact. And we have contact us twice. And the reason for that is our base.html. We have this right here. So let's go ahead and get rid of that. And we'll just be working off of this block content. Okay. So now I can fill out this form however I like, right? So my name, and then maybe my email, and then hi there. And I can hit send. What forms do by default is what's called a GET request, right? So they put all of those parameters into the URL. That is done by default if you don't declare what kind of method it is. So back into the form, we did not declare the method. So let's go ahead and change it to being method type of post. There's another thing you can add in here called action. Action means what endpoint do we want to send it to? In our case, we're sending it to contact. However, we don't actually have to put that if the view that's rendering that form, like in our case, it's this view, we can actually just put a period there or leave it empty altogether, and it will submit to the same view that is handling it. Of course, if you wanted to have this on a different view, you can do that as well. So go ahead and try out action after you understand what we're about to. So now if I refresh in here, let's go ahead and go back into contact, just raw contact there. Put my name in, put an email and some message and hit send. Now I get this CSRF token verification. This is built-in security by Django. All we need to do here is CSRF_token, and that will render the necessary field to allow me to submit this data. So going back in and try it again. This time I hit send. No errors happen. The form is cleared out. And, well, it seemed like something happened. Like the data went away. So what actually happened? Well, our view actually did handle this request, but we didn't see any of that data. So what we can do is we can print out the request data that's coming through. In my case, it's request post. It's post data. Right? So that would be a way to do it. Now, if I just go to this page and look at that print statement, I am not sending post data. I'm using a get method. So this isn't just an empty dictionary. But if I actually submit it again, now what I'll see is all of that data. So we've got our CSRF token. This is a security token, so no other web page can just submit this data. And then we have all of our fields filled out. That's pretty cool. So that means that our data is actually rendering in a raw form. We do not want to use the raw form data though. Instead, what we want to do is have Django Forms handle it for us. So now what we can do is create a form for this contact page. So I'm going to go ahead and put it inside of this configuration directory, and I'm going to call it forms.py. Now, typically, you would have your views and forms in NAP, right? I'm doing this as an illustration purposes, not something you would want to use long term, because what we're actually building up towards is really just making our app reusable. So we're going to go ahead and come in here and do from Django, we're going to import forms. And we're going to make a new form class, and this is going to just be our contact form. It inherits from forms.form, and now we want to have a few fields. So the fields in here, we want to have our full name, we want to have our email, and we want to have some content. Okay, so the full name is going to be equal to forms.char field or character field. The email itself will be forms.email field or an email field, right? And then finally, content is also forms.char field. Okay, and we can pass in a different widget and say forms.text area. We'll see what that looks like in a second. Okay, so with this, I'm going to go into my view. I'm going to bring it in here. So we'll do from.forms. I'm going to import that form. And now what I'm going to do is say the form is equal to that. And then we'll actually pass in this post data or none. As in, if this post data is empty, it's not really going to do this next step, which is validating the form. And we'll just say if form dot is valid, go ahead and print out form dot cleaned data. No worries, we'll go over this stuff in just a moment. So we save that. Let's get rid of that posted data now. And let's look back at our raw form here. I might have to restart the server again. And I've got this attribute area. I think I have a spelling or capitalization problem. This should be a lowercase a. That, of course, could be looked up on the Django docs. And let's go ahead and rerun that server. Okay. So now, I don't see anything that's related to Django here still. It's still that raw form, right? So it's still form.html here. Okay, so I can submit it again and hit send. Look at my terminal, and what do you know? I now have a dictionary that's actually related to Django. So what I actually did was I sent that requested data, the request post data, and I validated it. I don't know how it validated, but I know that it did, right? Because of this block here. So again, I don't know how it validated, so I will have to check out validated. And the way I do that is by using the Django form instead of our raw form. So I'm actually going to pass in that form instance to the template itself. I'm going to update how I write out my context here. We're going to pass this like that. And then in my form itself, instead of having these three inputs here, I can render out that form and just do form.asp. So the form's being passed as context. So we see here, this is the form class itself. That form, of course, is coming from a Django form. And then in our template, we actually render it like this. Okay. So now I refresh in here, and the form has changed. I now have labels for everything. And if I hit send, it's still sending that data, but it's also not refreshing that form. It's keeping that data there. So if I were to want to refresh it, I could just reiterate that form or reinitialize that form rather. And then this is how I'd reinitialize it. So I resubmit it, and now it's a clean form. And now it's all coming from Django. So if I actually submitted a bad email, let's say, for instance, like abc@abc, no extension, and I hit send, well, first of all, it's going to make me fill out the fields that are required. And now I hit send. This is Django Form validation right off the bat. So right there, it's cleaning and making sure that I have really good data. So I'm actually not going to go any further on this concept as far as the raw Django forms are concerned. There's a lot of things in the documentation to do that. I will talk about validation more later. But now I think you're at a point where you're really close to being able to take this data and storing it into a model itself, into its own app, and doing those sorts of things. Now what we want to do is use this same concept, but for creating new blog posts, right? So new model objects. We want to store that data in the database. Now what we're about to do, you could absolutely use for this, but you would probably, in the case of contact form, you'd probably have a different model specifically for that. So let's go into our blog, and we're going to save this file as forms.py. And we'll go ahead and do from Django import forms. I'm going to give it a class. This is going to be my blog post form, and it takes forms.form. Okay. So the first thing that I want is the title, right? So this is forms.char field or character field. Then I'm going to want slug, and this is forms.slug field. And then finally content, right? Forms.char field. And in this case, we can do widget equals to forms.text area. Okay. So now that we've got this, let's go ahead and bring this form into our create view. This one right here. So I'll go ahead and import it in. We'll do from.forms, import the blog post form. And then naturally in our create view, we can say form equals to post blog form. And again, it's request.post or none. And then if form.is valid, then we'll go ahead and print out the validated data or cleaned data. Cool. So naturally, I'm going to have this form in as context. And now I can actually think about what template I really need. I realize I made a template for the create, but perhaps I can use a different template, right? Perhaps in this create, I say form.html. And the reason for that is because we're just rendering out a form on this. It doesn't have to be like specific to that view. We can reuse this template over and over again, which is kind of cool. So naturally, I can actually extend from that template itself. But that's sort of redundant information. Instead, what I should do is in my view, just change the template I'm using and say form.html. Now, if I was going to make this absolutely pluggable, I would also make a form.html here that copies this other one. All right, so again, if I could drag and drop this somewhere, I would certainly want to make sure I have that. Okay, cool. So I'm going to be using the other one, so the templates, the original one. I'm not going to be using this one that we just created. So now that I've got this, I've got form.html. I can actually take a look at this view, and let's make sure our server's running. And then we're going to go ahead and do blog new. And what do you know? I have my form in here, and I could type out whatever I wanted and hit send. And when I hit send, I see that content come through. So this is the actual dictionary, right? So I can save this data inside of my view, right? So this is dictionary data, which means that I can grab each key value pair and say something like title equals to form.clean data, and then the title, right? And this would be really useful if you had a form for multiple models, right? And that's certainly possible, right? So you might have 15 different fields in here and you want them to go to 3 different models, for example. This would be a way to do that. You actually grab the individual data and then you would do something like object equals to blog post.objects.create title equals to title. I realize you may have not seen this syntax yet. It's not a whole lot different than doing this and then obj.title equals the title. But this is the built-in Django method versus the Python method where you would then do obj.save, right? So this is just saves a little bit of time setting everything up. Okay. So, of course, if you had another model, then you would do object2 equals to other model.objects.create, and then whatever you need to put here. So that's pretty cool. Of course, I'm not worrying about that right now. But instead what I can do, instead of actually getting each value from this data, I can just pass in that dictionary and unpack it with 2 stars form.cleaned data. What that does is it takes this dictionary and turns the key value pairs into arguments, much like we just saw, which is pretty cool. Okay, so now I can get rid of that. And after I save that data or create that data, I'll just do form equals to blog post form, and I'll just reinitialize that form. Okay, cool. So we save that, and let's try now. I'm going to actually send the same data that I had. I'll send it a couple times with a different slug. And we'll look in our admin for the blog posts. And what do you know? They're actually in there. Now this is pretty cool that I can do that now. I can save data from this form. But Django has something built in for forms and for models. They're called model forms. So basically what I mean is it's going to take the blog post model. So I'll call this blog post model form. And it's forms.model form. And I can actually use the model itself. So we say class meta model equals to. Of course, we need to import that model. So from.models import blog post model, or rather just blog post. I think that's the name of our model. And we set our model down here in the meta class. And then we do fields equals to title, slug, and content. Okay, so now I'm going to go ahead and use this in my view. Come in here and change our blog post form into our blog post model form. And now what I'm going to do is just do form.save. I no longer need that create. I can just do form.save just like that. And again, I can reinitialize. So we save that. Let's go back into that form. This time I'm going to go ahead and make another new one. Ooh, our title has changed. We'll explain why in a moment. Another title, another slug, and some content. We hit save. We look in our blog post, admin, and we refresh in there. And of course, there's our actual blog post. Okay, cool. So a couple things happened. One of the things was this title, right? Why is it a big text area? Well, that has to do with our model, right? We actually created the title as text field. Well, I probably don't want to have my titles being text field. Text field allows you to have a lot of data in there, right? So that makes a lot of sense for my content area, but not my title. My title should be char field or character field here. And we have to actually add in something called max length equaling to like 120 or 120 characters total. And then I'll go ahead and save that. Now, another way to accomplish this is to actually override the fields for each field that I'm bringing in, right? So I can actually use this same thing here, and this will actually convert it into a char field too. Now, you can still use widgets, so you could keep it the same as it was like this, but really this is probably the method I would end up going if I really just needed to change the form and not the model. But I want to change the model because I don't need that. Okay. And another important part to note is that I just did form.save. You can't do that unless it's a model. So I can also manipulate some of that data by saying object equals to form.save, commit equals to false. That means that it's not actually saving it. And then I could say object.title equals to form.cleaned data.get, the actual title. So this is a dictionary, so we can call .get on it, and then just add something like 0 or something like that. I don't know. And then object.save. Right, so that allows me to manipulate some of the data inside of the form itself. So let's go ahead and do a couple things here. We made changes to the models, so we do python manage.py, make migrations, and then python manage.py, migrate, and then we'll run the server again. And we'll test this part out. We take a look at our blog post now. Now it's down to a field that makes sense. We make some random slug. And notice that it ends with an S as the title. I hit send. I go into my blog posts here, 8. It added a 0 to the end because I added that 0 string. Of course, I don't actually want to do that, but it's nice to know that I can make some changes from the model form just like that. So that's model forms. They are pretty cool. They're based off of the model itself, and then you would just declare what fields from that model you want to include. If you remember back to our contact form, and I used something like ABC at ABC with some whatever other information, it said enter a valid email address. That is called form validation. Now we can have our own custom form validation as well. So let's look at the email itself. Right, so what I want to do is I'm going to make my own custom form validation. So I do clean underscore and then whatever I named the field. Right, so these are arbitrary names. They do make sense for what it is, but you would say something like email. And it takes in the argument of self, and you can do args and keyword args. So to get the actual email, you would do email equals to self.cleanedData.get email, or the name of the actual field, right? So this gives me that value, and then I would return what that value is. Okay, so let's take a look. I'll go ahead and print out that email, and this time I'm just going to add, .edu. Okay, we hit send. In my terminal, I see that I've printed out two things, right? One's from the view, one's from the form itself. So it actually printed out that email just fine. So I can prevent certain kinds of emails from coming in here. And this is true for any field, right? You could run a simple method to check whether or not this is a valid email. So I can do a condition, and I'll just say if email dot ends with .edu. So if the email string ends with .edu, then we'll raise a forms.validation error and say this is not a valid email. Please don't use .edu. Something like that. Okay, so I refresh, I resubmit it, same exact one with that email. This is not a valid email. Please don't use .edu. Cool. So that's a way to do validation right in our form. Now, naturally, I can also do this same thing in our model. Right? So let's go ahead and do title. So this time I'm going to say clean title. Title is one of my fields. This time it's actually coming from the model itself, not the form itself. So again, I have to change everything from email to title. And something that I can do is actually run a query set on this. So I can say QS equals to blogpost.objects.filter, and we would say title equals to title. Right? So this is looking to see if there's any values of that, and then I would do something like QS.exists. This, the validation error being this title has already been used. Please try again. Okay, so now I have a way to actually clean out what that title is. And let's go ahead and make a new one with a title that I know exists. So blog-new. I called it Tesla, one of them was. And I say ABC, and then I hit some content, and what do you know? That's a very practical example of a title that we don't want to reuse without putting that unique clause in here, right? So the form will also make sure that we aren't using that unique clause. So let's go ahead and grab one of our slugs, doesn't really matter which one, and hit send. That will also show up. So that's pretty cool. Now what I actually showed you was another way to prevent the same exact value from being used again. And to really make this query set call better, we use the case insensitive I contains or I exact. So I exact means that if I used a lowercase t for Tesla and hit send, it would still say the same thing. Now if I didn't do that and I ran it, it doesn't say that thing, right? I still have a validation error with the slug, but I have to capitalize the T in order for that to work, and that's why we use iExact here. And that way, it doesn't matter how things are capitalized in here, it's still going to be actually going off of that. Pretty cool.